Victoria. The voice on the other end of the line was barely more than a ragged, trembling whisper. Victoria, I am so incredibly sorry. I tried to stall them. I demanded to see the federal warrant, but they bypassed me entirely. I sat perfectly still at my mahogany desk, the city skyline stretching out behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. At 41 years old, as the director of corporate compliance for one of the largest logistics firms on the eastern seaboard, I was intimately familiar with the anatomy of a panic attack. I could hear it in the shallow, rapid breathing of David Miller, the senior branch manager at First Metropolitan Depository. "Breathe, David," I said softly, my voice maintaining the steady, frictionless cadence of a metronome. "Tell me exactly what is happening in the vault." "The FBI is here," David choked out, the background noise of the call suddenly filling with the heavy, echoing thud of tactical boots against marble floors. "The Financial Crimes Division. They locked down the entire subterranean level. They didn't even ask for your guard key. They brought a structural locksmith, Victoria. They just took a heavy-duty tungsten carbide drill directly to the brass faceplate of your safe deposit box. They're tearing it completely open." I closed my eyes, letting the visceral, deeply violating imagery wash over me. Safe Deposit Box 714 was supposed to be a sanctuary. It was a long, heavy steel drawer encased in 2 feet of reinforced concrete and solid iron, resting in the darkest, most secure basement in the city. Inside that box was the sum total of my family's actual uncorrupted legacy. It held my late grandmother's velvet-lined wooden case, containing the Romanov-era sapphire ring she had smuggled out of Europe. It held original birth certificates, the deed to a small lakeside cabin my grandfather built by hand, and a stack of fragile, sepia-toned photographs of ancestors who actually understood the meaning of integrity. And now, a team of federal agents in Kevlar vests was ripping it apart, their gloved hands rummaging through my grandmother's pearls, searching for the rot my parents had buried beside them. "Did they say what they were looking for, David?" I asked, though I already knew the answer with absolute, terrifying certainty. "Cash," David whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and profound confusion. "Victoria, I saw inside the box before they shoved me out of the vault. There were stacks of it. Bundles of $100 bills wrapped in industrial rubber bands, wedged right next to your grandmother's jewelry case. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in raw, undeclared currency. They're bagging it all as evidence. They handed me a seizure notice. Victoria, they think you're laundering money. Thank you for calling me, David. Do not speak to them without the bank's general counsel present," I instructed calmly and severed the connection. I didn't throw my phone across the room. I didn't break down into hysterical tears. I simply placed the device face down on my spotless desk, stood up and smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored charcoal skirt suit. I walked over to the wet bar in the corner of my office and poured myself a glass of iced mineral water and took a long, slow sip. The betrayal had been executed with the kind of breathtaking sociopathic arrogance that only my parents could muster. My father, Richard Sterling, was the city commissioner for urban zoning and development. My mother, Evelyn, was a high society philanthropist who spent her days hosting charity galas and her nights meticulously managing my father's alternative revenue streams. For a decade, Richard had essentially operated as a white-collar toll booth. If a commercial developer wanted a high-rise approved or an environmental restriction bypassed, a heavily padded envelope of untraceable, non-sequential $100 bills had to find its way into Evelyn's manicured hands. But hiding that kind of illicit physical wealth in the modern banking era is incredibly difficult. As a high-profile politician, Richard's domestic bank accounts, real estate holdings, and stock portfolios were subjected to rigorous annual audits by the State Ethics Committee, They couldn't put the bribe money in a traditional bank. They couldn't bury it in the backyard. They needed a blind spot, a financial black hole completely insulated from government scrutiny. They needed a patsy with an absolutely pristine, unimpeachable federal record. They needed their 41-year-old daughter. 3 years ago, I was hospitalized for a week with a severe case of bacterial pneumonia. In my feverish, exhausted state, I handed my parents my apartment keys so they could feed my rescue cat and bring my mail inside. My key ring also held the small or intricately cut brass key to First Metropolitan Box 714. I had trusted them. I had assumed that the inherent biological boundaries of parenthood would protect me. But while I was lying in a hospital bed attached to an IV drip, my father had taken my key ring to a shadow locksmith. He had a master wax mold cast and a perfect, untraceable duplicate struck. For 36 months, while I was busy building my career and auditing corporate supply chains, my parents were quietly taking the elevator down to the subterranean vault of First Metropolitan. Because my name was the only one on the lease, the bank never flagged the activity. Richard and Evelyn simply forged my signature on the access log, used their duplicate key alongside the banker's guard key, and treated my sacred family reliquary like a dirty, illicit piggy bank. Then they stuffed hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal bribery payouts right next to my grandmother's wedding ring. They used my clean name, my flawless credit, and my complete ignorance as a human shield against the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They knew that if the FBI ever tracked the money, the warrant would have my name on it, not theirs. They were willing to let me rot in a federal penitentiary for 20 years just so they could keep their hands clean. My desk phone chimed, snapping me back to the present. The digital display blinked with the name of my executive assistant, Sarah. "Yes, Sarah," I answered, pressing the speaker button. "Miss Sterling," Sarah said, her voice tight, desperately trying to maintain her professional composure. "There are 4 gentlemen in the reception area. They flashed badges. Or they said they are with the FBI Financial Crimes Division, and they are demanding to see you immediately. Shall I call building security?" "No, Sarah, that won't be necessary," I replied, my voice as cool and placid as a frozen lake. "Please offer them coffee and escort them directly into my office." I walked back to my desk and sat down in my heavy leather chair. I folded my hands perfectly in front of me, staring at the heavy oak doors of my office. My parents thought they had engineered the perfect airtight frame job. They were currently sitting in their sprawling, custom-built suburban estate, drinking expensive scotch, fully expecting the FBI to drag their daughter out of a corporate high-rise in handcuffs. But my parents made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was just a blind, trusting daughter. And they forgot what I do for a living. I am a senior corporate auditor. I hunt anomalies for a living. I notice microscopic discrepancies that other human beings walk blindly past. And 8 months ago, when I visited my safe deposit box to retrieve my passport, I noticed that the tiny, microscopic layer of velvet dust on the interior hinge of my grandmother's jewelry box had been disturbed by a fraction of a millimeter. The FBI wasn't walking into my office to arrest a victim. They were walking into a meticulously prepared slaughterhouse. The heavy, solid oak doors of my corner office did not just open, they were breached. There was no polite knock. There was no hesitation. The doors swung inward with a violent, synchronized force that sent a rush of air across my mahogany desk, fluttering the edges of my quarterly compliance reports. Then my executive assistant, Sarah, stood in the hallway behind them, her face completely drained of color, her hands hovering nervously over her tablet. She looked as though she was about to witness an execution. 4 men walked into my office. They did not wear the tactical Kevlar vests of a SWAT raid, nor the windbreakers of a street-level bust. They wore impeccably tailored dark charcoal suits. They moved with the terrifying, frictionless synchronization of apex predators who were entirely accustomed to walking into the highest echelons of corporate America and completely dismantling them. The lead agent stopped exactly 3 feet from the edge of my desk. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a razor-sharp jawline, prematurely silver hair, and eyes that looked like chipped flint. He didn't blink. And he didn't offer a polite morning greeting. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his suit jacket, produced a worn leather credential case, and flipped it open, letting the heavy gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation catch the ambient light from my floor-to-ceiling windows. "Victoria Sterling," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that completely swallowed the hum of the city traffic outside. It wasn't a question. It was a gavel striking wood. "I am Supervisory Special Agent Jonathan Hayes, Financial Crimes Division. We need you to step away from your computer, keep your hands where we can see them, and stand up." The 3 agents behind him immediately fanned out, securing the perimeter of the room. One positioned himself blocking the oak doors. Another moved silently toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, or scanning the street below. The third stepped slightly to Hayes's left, his hand resting casually yet terrifyingly near the subtle bulge of a holstered firearm beneath his suit jacket. They were expecting panic. They were expecting the typical, predictable collapse of a white-collar executive whose pristine, insulated world had just been violently shattered. They expected me to hyperventilate, to demand a lawyer, to threaten them with my father's political connections, or to break down into hysterical, performative tears. I did absolutely none of those things. I remained perfectly seated in my heavy leather chair. I didn't reach for my keyboard. I didn't raise my hands in a gesture of surrender. I simply looked at the gold shield, then slowly raised my eyes to meet Agent Hayes's cold, flinty stare. I held his gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds, establishing a baseline of absolute, unwavering dominance in my own territory. "Good morning, Agent Hayes," I said, my voice as placid and smooth as the surface of a frozen lake. I gestured elegantly toward the 2 plush leather armchairs positioned opposite my desk. "Please have a seat. Can Sarah get you or your team a coffee? An espresso, perhaps? You look like you've had an incredibly busy morning." Hayes's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. The complete absence of fear in my voice momentarily jammed his psychological circuitry. He wasn't used to suspects offering hospitality while staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. "We are not here for coffee, Miss Sterling," Hayes said, his tone dropping an octave, abandoning the procedural script for raw intimidation. And he stepped forward and aggressively slapped a thick manila envelope onto the polished surface of my desk. He flipped it open, sliding a series of high-resolution, glossy 8x10 photographs directly into my line of sight. 20 minutes ago, a federal judge granted us an emergency warrant to bypass the master locking mechanism of First Metropolitan Depository Box 714, Hayes stated, his voice dripping with cold, calculated venom. "A box that is leased exclusively under your legal name, accessed exclusively by your signature, and maintained exclusively by your banking credentials." I looked down at the photographs. The camera flash from the federal crime scene photographers illuminated the brutal reality of my parents' treason. The first photo showed the heavy brass faceplate of the safe deposit box completely destroyed, the lock drilled out into a mess of metallic shavings. The second photo showed the long steel drawer pulled out onto a velvet viewing table, and there it was. Nestled intimately against the worn, velvet-lined wooden case containing my late grandmother's sapphire ring and her delicate pearls were the bricks. Dozens of them. Thick, heavy stacks of Benjamin Franklins, bound tightly by thick industrial rubber bands. The money looked dirty, chaotic, and profoundly vulgar, resting against the elegant, sepia-toned history of my family. Seeing it in high definition sent a spike of pure, unadulterated revulsion through my nervous system. My parents hadn't just used my name, they had desecrated the only pure things my family had left. $850,000, Miss Sterling, Hayes continued, leaning his knuckles heavily onto my desk, invading my personal space. in raw, non-sequential, undeclared U.S. currency, stacked right next to your birth certificate and your family heirlooms. He paused, letting the astronomical number hang in the quiet air of the office. He was waiting for the fracture. He was waiting for the moment my corporate armor cracked. We have been building a RICO case against municipal zoning corruption for 2 years, Hayes pressed, his eyes searching my face for any micro-expression of guilt. We knew developers were paying bribes to fast-track commercial permits. We just couldn't find where the cash was being housed until we subpoenaed the financial metadata of every high-ranking city official's immediate family members. You thought the subterranean vault was a black hole. You thought your pristine corporate compliance record made you invisible. You were wrong. I reached out and delicately picked up the photograph of the drilled box. I held it by the edges, studying the image with the detached clinical precision of an art appraiser. "Are you arresting me, Agent Hayes?" I asked softly, my eyes still fixed on the photograph. "I am giving you a very brief, very narrow window of opportunity to save the rest of your life," Hayes fired back, his patience thinning. "You are looking at federal charges for money laundering, conspiracy to commit extortion, and tax evasion. That is a 20-year mandatory minimum in a federal penitentiary. You will lose your career. You will lose your license. You will be completely destroyed. Now, you can either stand up, turn around, and put your hands behind your back, or you can tell me exactly who those developers are, and we can discuss a plea agreement." I slowly lowered the photograph back onto the desk. I folded my hands together, resting them on the mahogany surface, and looked up at the 4 heavily armed federal agents surrounding me. "Agent Hayes," I began, my voice carrying the steady, authoritative cadence I used when dismembering fraudulent corporate supply chains. "I am the Director of Corporate Compliance for a $3 billion logistics firm. I spend 80 hours a week designing encrypted financial architecture to prevent the exact type of primitive, idiotic cash smuggling operation you just described." I leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between us, matching his intensity not with anger, but with absolute terrifying logic. If I were going to launder $850,000 of illicit bribe money, I would not wrap it in rubber bands and stuff it into a subterranean metal box leased under my own primary Social Security number, I stated cleanly, letting the insult to his intelligence land perfectly. I would wash it through a decentralized web of shell companies in the Cayman Islands, utilizing blockchain obfuscation, and legally repatriate it as consulting dividends. I would never, under any circumstances, leave a physical paper trail leading directly to my own front door. Hayes scoffed, crossing his arms. "Criminals make stupid mistakes all the time, Ms. Sterling. Arrogance breeds sloppiness. Your signature is on the bank's access log. The key is required for entry. The money is in your box. A signature is just ink on a page. To Agent Hayes, it is a biological motion that can be forged by any amateur with a light box and a steady hand," I countered seamlessly, never breaking eye contact. "And a physical key is nothing more than milled brass. It is an archaic, laughably vulnerable security measure. Neither of those things constitute biometric, undeniable proof of entry. Are you seriously trying to tell me that someone broke into a federal depository, forged your signature, bypassed the guard, and deposited nearly $1 million into your box without your knowledge?" Hayes asked, his voice dripping with absolute sarcasm. "That is the defense you are going with?" "No, Agent Hayes," I said, a slow, incredibly sharp smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. It wasn't a smile of warmth. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey step willingly into the trap. "I am telling you that I haven't set foot inside First Metropolitan Depository in 8 months, but I know exactly who has, and I know exactly how they did it." I shifted my gaze to the thick manila envelope still resting on my desk. Before we continue this conversation and before you attempt to place me in handcuffs, I said, my tone dropping into a low, uncompromising command, I need you to tell me exactly what you placed in the primary evidence bag alongside my grandmother's jewelry case, specifically a vintage black resin writing instrument. Did your team bag the pen? Agent Hayes froze. The aggressive, condescending posture instantly vanished from his shoulders. He looked at me, then looked down at the photos, a sudden, chilling realization dawning in his eyes. "How do you know about the pen?" Hayes whispered. Agent Hayes didn't shout. He didn't slam his hands on the desk. He whispered the question, his voice stripped entirely of its previous federal arrogance, leaving behind only the raw, unsettling confusion of a predator that had just realized it was standing in the middle of a trap. The 3 heavily armed agents surrounding my desk subtly shifted their weight. The atmosphere in my corner office fundamentally mutated. 30 seconds ago, I was a terrified corporate executive facing 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. Now, I was the only person in the room who actually understood the architecture of the battlefield. 8 months ago, Agent Hayes, I said, leaning back into my heavy leather chair and steepling my fingers together with slow, deliberate precision. I went down to the subterranean vault at First Metropolitan to retrieve my passport for a corporate compliance audit in Geneva. When I opened Box 714, I noticed an incredibly minor, almost microscopic anomaly. I paused, letting my eyes drift over the glossy crime scene photographs still resting on my mahogany desk, focusing on the velvet-lined wooden case. My grandmother's jewelry case has rested in the exact same position, in the exact same corner of that steel drawer, for 12 years, I explained, my voice echoing clinically in the quiet office. But when I opened it, the ambient layer of velvet dust on the interior brass hinge had been disturbed. A fraction of a millimeter. Someone had touched the box. Someone with authorized, unimpeded access to my private reliquary. Hayes stared at me, on his flinty eyes wide, the mental gears grinding as he desperately tried to catch up to a timeline I had started 240 days ago. "I am a senior auditor, Agent Hayes," I said softly, the temperature in the room plummeting. "When I find a discrepancy in a logistical supply chain, I do not alert the suspect. I do not panic. I simply install a mechanism to capture the failure point in high definition. So, I visited a private, highly specialized security contractor in Zurich, and I placed a vintage, black resin Mont Blanc Meisterstück 149 fountain pen right next to my grandmother's pearls." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the desk, locking eyes with the supervisory special agent of the FBI. It was time for the technical autopsy. "The writing instrument your evidence team just confiscated from my safe deposit box does not hold ink," I stated, delivering the Sorkin-esque rapid-fire breakdown with frictionless authority. "The resin barrel houses a custom-milled, motion-activated, ultra-low-light 4K micro-optics lens with a 120-degree field of view. It is hardwired to a solid state, 256-bit AES military-grade encrypted micro-SD card, powered by a dormant lithium-ion microcell that activates exclusively when the ambient light of the vault hits the sensor." I let the heavy, dense technical terminology hang in the air for a single heartbeat before delivering the lethal translation. "In simple, undeniable terms, Agent Hayes," I whispered, a razor-thin smile touching my lips. "It is a microscopic security camera, and it has been silently recording the face, the voice, and the actions of every single human being who has opened that steel drawer for the last 8 months. The silence in my office was so profound I could hear the rhythmic ticking of my analog wristwatch. Hayes swallowed hard. The prominent vein in his neck throbbed. He didn't ask me for permission. He didn't hesitate. He immediately turned his head toward the agent standing by the oak doors, a younger man holding a heavy, encrypted Federal Field laptop. "Call the vault team," Hayes barked, his voice cracking like a whip. "Tell evidence recovery to isolate the Mont Blanc pen. Tell them to unscrew the resin barrel, extract the micro SD card, and plug it directly into the field terminal. I want a secure, encrypted feed piped to your laptop right now. Move." The young agent scrambled, whirlpulling a secure satellite phone from his jacket and rapidly relaying the orders. The next 3 minutes were a masterclass in bureaucratic panic. I sat perfectly still, sipping my iced mineral water, watching the absolute destruction of their original narrative play out in real time. "Sir, the vault team has the card," the young agent announced, his fingers flying across the keyboard of his laptop as he set it down directly on my desk, facing Hayes. "It's a heavily encrypted partition. We can't crack a 256-bit AES in the field without the key." Hayes looked at me. He didn't demand the password. He looked at me with the quiet, terrifying realization that I was holding the leash, and he was the one fetching the evidence. "Alpha Romeo Tango 799er Bravo," I recited cleanly, not missing a single beat, yet reciting the randomized alphanumeric sequence from memory. "Capitalize the Alpha and the Bravo, # at the end." The young agent typed the decryption key. A heavy digital clack echoed from the laptop speakers as the partition shattered open. "I have a root directory," the tech agent breathed, his eyes scanning the screen. "There are 14 separate video files, time-stamped and dated." "Play the most recent one," Hayes commanded, leaning over the laptop, his hands gripping the edge of my desk so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. "Put it on full screen. Maximize the audio." The screen flickered black for a millisecond before the 4K video feed erupted into existence. The image was breathtakingly crisp, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent overhead lights of the subterranean vault. The angle was positioned from the bottom corner of the steel drawer, looking slightly upward. And there, captured in undeniable, federal-level high definition, were the faces of my parents. Richard Sterling, the city commissioner for urban zoning, and Evelyn Sterling, his philanthropic wife, were standing in the sterile vault. They were entirely alone. They were not being coerced. They were not under duress. They were laughing. "God, I hate coming down to this dusty basement," my mother's voice complained through the laptop speakers, her tone dripping with upper-class disdain. She reached into her designer Hermes handbag and pulled out 4 thick, heavy bricks of $100 bills wrapped in industrial rubber bands. "It's the cost of doing business, Evie," my father chuckled, his voice echoing cleanly in the recording. Then he reached into the box, his manicured hands carelessly shoving my grandmother's delicate wooden jewelry case aside to make room. The visceral disrespect made my stomach violently turn, but I kept my face an absolute mask of stone. The Marcus Development Group paid the zoning expedited fee in full, Richard bragged, tossing the raw cash into the back of my safe deposit box. $300,000 untraceable. And the best part? If the State Ethics Committee ever audits my accounts, they won't find a single dime. Victoria's squeaky clean corporate compliance record is the best political shield I ever built. They'd never suspect the straight-A daughter. On the screen, Evelyn laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. She reached down into the box, directly into the frame of the hidden camera. Warren casually picked up my grandmother's antique sapphire ring. She tried it on her index finger, admiring it under the vault lights. "Do you think she even checks this box anymore?" Evelyn asked, pulling the ring off and tossing it carelessly back into the wooden case. "She works 80 hours a week. She's too busy auditing shipping manifests to notice we're using her little time capsule as a rainy day fund." "Let her work." Richard smiled, slamming the heavy steel drawer shut, plunging the video feed into absolute pitch-black darkness. The video ended. The office fell back into a deafening, suffocating silence. Agent Hayes slowly stood up from the laptop. The flinty, aggressive federal investigator who had walked into my office 10 minutes ago, ready to destroy my life, was entirely gone. He stared at the black screen of the computer, processing the sheer sociopathic magnitude of the betrayal he had just witnessed. He had spent 2 years hunting the city commissioner, and the man's own daughter had just gift-wrapped him in 4K resolution with full audio confessions. Hayes slowly turned his head and looked at me. "They used your pristine federal record to shield a $1 million extortion ring," Hayes whispered, the absolute disgust evident in his voice. He looked at the crime scene photographs of the cash resting against my family heirlooms, finally understanding the true victim of the crime. "They framed their own flesh and blood. They were going to let you take the fall." "Yes, Agent Hayes, they were," I said softly, closing the file folder on my desk with a definitive, clinical snap. I stood up from my leather chair, smoothing my charcoal skirt, reclaiming the absolute vertical authority of the room. "But as I mentioned earlier," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper, "I am a senior corporate auditor. When I find a parasite in my system, I do not just document it, I eradicate it. Now, Agent Hayes, shall we discuss how you and I are going to arrest the city commissioner?" The silence in my corner office was no longer tense. It was entirely deferential. The 3 junior agents who just moments ago had been poised to forcefully place me in zip ties now looked at me as if I were a bomb technician who had just casually defused a nuclear warhead with a bent paperclip. Supervisory Special Agent Jonathan Hayes slowly reached out and closed the lid of the encrypted Federal Field laptop. He let out a long, heavy exhale. Soon it was the distinct sound of a man who had spent 2 agonizing years banging his head against a bureaucratic brick wall, only to watch that wall suddenly collapse into fine dust at his feet. "You let us execute a federal raid," Hayes said, his voice a mixture of absolute awe and profound professional respect. He ran a hand through his prematurely silver hair. "You knew they were using the box. You had the 4K video evidence 8 months ago. Why didn't you just walk into the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington and hand my division the flash drive? Why let it get to the point where we drilled your vault?" "Because of the operational liquidity of a corrupt, entrenched politician, Agent Hayes," I replied smoothly, sitting back down in my heavy leather chair and delicately adjusting the cuffs of my charcoal blazer. "My father is a city commissioner with 3 decades of accumulated political power. He has dinner with federal judges. He plays golf with the district attorney." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany wood, my voice dropping to a surgical, uncompromising precision. If I had simply mailed you an SD card, my father would have mobilized a small army of vicious appellate attorneys. He would have claimed the video was a deep fake generated by political rivals. Or worse, he would have claimed the cash was a legitimate anonymous campaign donation that he had temporarily stored in my box for safekeeping until he could properly declare it. He would have tied your division up in federal court for a decade, bleeding the taxpayers dry. I paused, letting my eyes lock onto his flinty stare, delivering the lethal technical autopsy of my own strategy. "I didn't just need you to see the crime, Agent Hayes. I needed you to establish an unbreakable, undeniable federal chain of custody. I needed your evidence recovery team to physically drill that brass faceplate, document the exact serial numbers of the raw currency, and bag it under a Title 18 seizure warrant before my father even realized he was under investigation." I let the heavy silence settle over the room before delivering the translation. "In simple, tactical terms," I said, a cold, razor-thin smile touching my eyes, "I couldn't just give you the proof. I had to let you empty his wallet first, so he couldn't afford to fight you when you finally put him in a cage." Hayes stared at me. A slow, dark, incredibly dangerous grin spread across his face. Now he reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his encrypted tactical radio, and looked at his 3 junior agents. "Stand down entirely," Hayes commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Ms. Sterling is not a suspect. She is the most valuable confidential informant this division has seen in a decade." He turned back to me, leaning his hip against the edge of my desk, crossing his arms. The dynamic had completely inverted. I was no longer the subject of an interrogation. I was the architect of the operation. "So, Director Sterling," Hayes murmured, a glint of predatory anticipation in his eyes. "How do you want to play this? I have enough probable cause right now to send a 20-man SWAT element to kick the mahogany doors of his estate off their hinges." "No," I said instantly, my tone sharp and dismissive. "If you raid the suburban estate, he immediately goes into politician mode. He calls his press secretary. He plays the victim of a partisan witch hunt for the 6 o'clock news. We do this quietly. We do this here, on my territory." I reached across the desk and pulled my smartphone toward me. "My father thinks I am currently being arrested," I explained, my voice turning frighteningly calm. "He is sitting at home, drinking expensive scotch, waiting for the bank manager to confirm that his daughter has taken the fall for his extortion ring. I am going to call him. I am going to tell him that I am terrified, that the FBI is tearing my office apart, and that I desperately need him." Hayes nodded slowly, instantly grasping the psychological warfare at play. "He'll come. Oh, he'll want to be in the room to make sure you don't accidentally say anything that implicates him. He'll come to manage the fallout and play the hero." "Exactly," I said, unlocking my phone. "And when he walks through those oak doors expecting to find a broken, hysterical daughter begging for a lawyer, you're going to introduce him to the Mont Blanc pen." I tapped the screen, dialed my father's private cell number, and put the device on speakerphone. The rhythmic dial tone echoed loudly in the quiet office. The 4 heavily armed FBI agents stood in absolute silence, watching a masterclass in corporate deception unfold. "Victoria," Richard's voice crackled through the speaker after the second ring. He sounded appropriately groggy, but the underlying, vibrating tension in his voice was unmistakable to anyone who knew him. He was acting. "Dad," I gasped. I didn't just speak the word. I shattered my vocal cords. I forced my diaphragm to contract rapidly, making my breathing sound shallow, ragged, and completely out of control, mimicking the exact physiological symptoms of a severe panic attack. I let a genuine tear of pure, focused adrenaline prick the corner of my eye, allowing the raw emotion to bleed directly into my voice. "Dad, please. You have to come to the office. Right now," I sobbed, gripping the edge of the mahogany desk so tightly my knuckles turned white, selling the physical reality of the terror. "Bring Mom, please." "Victoria, slow down. What is happening?" Richard demanded, adopting the perfect booming tone of a fiercely protective patriarch. "The FBI is here, Dad," I cried out, letting a note of absolute hysteria crack my voice. "They're in my office." "Tell," the bank manager called. "They drilled open box 714 at First Metropolitan. They said they found hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. They think I'm laundering money, Dad. They have handcuffs. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the line. It was just a fraction of a millisecond, but I heard it. I heard the microscopic exhale of profound, sickening relief from my father. It was the sigh of a monster realizing his human shield had successfully absorbed the bullet. "Do not say another word to them, Victoria," Richard commanded, his voice dripping with fake righteous indignation. "Invoke your right to counsel immediately. Your mother and I are getting in the car right now. We are 20 minutes away. I am going to call the police commissioner. Nobody touches my daughter. Do you hear me? Stay strong." "Please hurry," I whimpered pathetically, and then my finger tapped the red button, severing the connection. The fake tears vanished instantly. The ragged, hyperventilating breathing stopped. My heart rate dropped back to a steady, clinical 60 beats per minute. I smoothed my blazer, looked up at Agent Hayes, and my face became a mask of absolute terrifying stone. "The city commissioner is on his way," I stated flatly. 22 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of my office swung open again. My executive assistant, Sarah, didn't even try to stop them. Richard and Evelyn Sterling marched into the reception area with the breathtaking, blinding arrogance of the untouchable political elite. Richard was wearing a tailored navy suit and a silver tie, or the uniform of a man accustomed to giving orders and having the world immediately bend to his will. Evelyn was draped in a $1,000 cashmere trench coat, her face pinched into a flawless mask of maternal outrage. They burst into my office ready to perform the greatest theatrical production of their lives. They were entirely prepared to act horrified at the allegations, to threaten the FBI with political ruin, and to gently, tragically, watch their only daughter be hauled away to federal prison for a crime they had meticulously framed her for. But the scene they walked into was entirely catastrophically wrong. I was not in handcuffs. I was not crying. I was sitting perfectly straight behind my mahogany desk, my hands folded elegantly in front of me, looking completely serene. Our supervisory special agent Hayes was leaning casually against the edge of my desk, his arms crossed, watching the door with a predatory smirk. The encrypted field laptop was open, turned completely around so the screen faced the doorway. It was paused on a frozen, brilliantly clear 4K frame of Richard's face, laughing inside the subterranean vault, holding a brick of $100 bills. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. The polished leather of his expensive Italian shoes skidded slightly on the hardwood floor. Evelyn bumped into his back, letting out a sharp, confused gasp. "Victoria!" "What is this?" Richard demanded. His voice faltered. The booming, patriarchal authority suddenly evaporated from his chest as his brain desperately tried to process the visual anomaly in front of him. He looked at me, then at Hayes. "Agent, I am City Commissioner Richard Sterling. I demand to know why you are harassing my daughter." Agent Hayes didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply looked at me, deferring the floor to the true authority in the room. I stood up slowly. I walked around the edge of my heavy mahogany desk, the heels of my shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor, until I was standing exactly 2 feet in front of the man who had traded my freedom for a stack of dirty cash. "They aren't harassing me, Dad," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, a cold surgical instrument preparing to make the final cut. "They're just returning some of Grandmother's jewelry, although they did have a few questions about the Mont Blanc pen." The Mont Blanc pen. Richard's brain, accustomed to decades of slick political maneuvering and backroom municipal deals, me stalled completely. He stared at me, his brow furrowing, desperately trying to contextualize the writing instrument I had just mentioned. Then, slowly, agonizingly, his gaze drifted back to the encrypted Federal Field laptop resting on my mahogany desk. I didn't give him time to formulate a lie. I didn't give him the oxygen to spin a political narrative. I simply reached past Agent Hayes, extended my index finger, and tapped the spacebar. The 4K video feed roared to life in the dead silence of my corner office. The audio was pristine, captured by the high-fidelity microphone hidden inside the resin barrel of the pen. The sound of my parents' voices, arrogant, mocking, and deeply incriminatory, bounced off the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Marcus Development Group paid the zoning expedited fee in full. Richard's digital voice bragged through the laptop speakers, perfectly synchronized with his high-definition image, tossing the rubber-banded bricks of $100 bills into my safe deposit box. 300,000 untraceable. And the best part? If the state ethics committee ever audits my accounts, they won't find a single dime. Victoria's squeaky clean corporate compliance record is the best political shield I ever built. I watched the blood completely, totally drain from my father's face. The tailored navy suit suddenly seemed 3 sizes too big for him. The booming, untouchable city commissioner evaporated, leaving behind a terrified 65-year-old man watching his own digital execution. Then, the video shifted to Evelyn. Her clear, then cruel laughter filled the room as she picked up my grandmother's antique sapphire ring, trying it on her finger under the harsh vault lights. Do you think she even checks this box anymore? She works 80 hours a week. She's too busy auditing shipping manifests to notice we're using her little time capsule as a rainy day fund. Evelyn physically staggered backward. The $1,000 cashmere trench coat slipped from her shoulders, pooling uselessly on the hardwood floor. She clapped a trembling hand over her mouth, a horrific, strangled gasp escaping her throat. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it bordered on madness. I hit the spacebar again. The video paused, freezing on the exact frame of Evelyn carelessly tossing the sacred family heirloom back into the wooden box like it was a piece of cheap plastic. "And you were right about one thing, Mom," I said, my voice echoing clinically in the suffocating silence. I stepped closer to her, invading her space, letting the absolute zero temperature of my anger radiate into her bones. I do work 80 hours a week auditing supply chains. I hunt logistical anomalies for a living. I track microscopic fractions of a cent across international borders. Did you honestly, truly believe that I wouldn't notice a disturbance in my own private vault? Evelyn couldn't speak. She just shook her head frantically, tears of absolute panic instantly ruining her immaculate makeup. I turned my attention back to the city commissioner. "You didn't just forge a key, Dad," I whispered, my tone dropping to a surgical, uncompromising precision. "You weaponized my entire life. Nang, you took my clean federal record, the career I bled for, the reputation I built, and you used it as a bulletproof vest for your extortion ring. You were perfectly willing to let me rot in a federal penitentiary for 20 years so you could keep drinking expensive scotch in your custom-built estate." "Victoria, please," Richard choked out. His voice was a reedy, pathetic wheeze. He raised his trembling hands, palms out, as if trying to physically push the reality of the room away. "It's not what it looks like. The video, it's out of context. The Marcus Group, they made a campaign contribution. It wasn't a bribe. I was just holding it there temporarily. You have to tell them, Victoria. You're my daughter. You have to protect your family." I looked at him with the detached, clinical disgust of a scientist examining a parasite under a microscope. "You are not my family, Richard," I stated cleanly, severing the biological tie with absolute finality. "You are a localized corruption point in my logistical network, and I have just successfully quarantined you." I took a deliberate step backward, clearing the line of sight between my parents and the 4 heavily armed federal agents waiting in the wings. I looked at Supervisory Special Agent Jonathan Hayes and gave a single subtle nod. Hayes pushed himself off the edge of my mahogany desk. The predatory smirk on his face was entirely gone, replaced by the crushing, terrifying weight of the United States Department of Justice. "Richard Sterling, Evelyn Sterling," Hayes commanded, his baritone voice shattering the last remnants of their elite political bubble. He reached for the heavy steel handcuffs on his tactical belt. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit extortion, systemic money laundering, and severe violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." "No, no, Arthur, do something!" Evelyn shrieked hysterically as 2 junior agents grabbed her arms, wrenching them forcefully behind her back. The ratcheting click of the metal teeth locking around her wrists echoed violently in the office. Richard didn't fight. When Agent Hayes grabbed his wrists and slammed the heavy steel cuffs shut, the city commissioner simply went limp. The reality of the 4K video had completely lobotomized his will to resist. He knew with absolute mathematical certainty that no lawyer on planet Earth could beat a high-definition confession recorded directly inside a federal depository. "You have the right to remain silent," Hayes recited smoothly, turning Richard around to face the oak doors. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." I stood perfectly still behind my desk, my hands folded elegantly in front of me, and watched the FBI march my parents out of my pristine corner office. Sarah, my executive assistant, stood in the hallway with wide eyes, watching the untouchable city commissioner and his philanthropic wife being frog-marched toward the service elevators in Federal Iron. They didn't look back at me. They didn't have the strength. The fallout was a masterpiece of federal efficiency, because I had handed Agent Hayes an unbreakable, undeniably authenticated chain of custody. The DOJ didn't even need to offer a plea deal. They brought the hammer down with biblical force. Under the RICO statutes, the FBI executed total, immediate asset forfeiture. They seized the sprawling suburban estate. They froze the offshore Cayman accounts Evelyn had meticulously managed. They auctioned off the luxury cars, the country club shares, and the art collection. The State Ethics Committee publicly dismantled Richard's 30-year political legacy, wiping his name from every municipal building he had ever touched. 14 months later, a federal judge sentenced Richard to 22 years in a maximum security penitentiary. Evelyn, entirely unable to handle the brutal reality of a women's correctional facility, who turned state's evidence against 3 other corrupt city officials just to secure a reduced 15-year sentence. They were permanently, hopelessly ruined. As for me, First Metropolitan Depository issued a profound, groveling apology for the security breach. They paid for a new, state-of-the-art titanium vault door and completely restored my grandmother's jewelry case. The logistics firm I worked for didn't fire me. In fact, the board of directors was so deeply terrified and simultaneously impressed by my ruthless surgical destruction of a sitting city commissioner that they promoted me to chief risk officer just 3 weeks later. I sit in the exact same corner office. The mahogany desk is spotless. The floor-to-ceiling windows still overlook the city I helped clean up, and my federal record remains absolutely flawlessly pristine. Where if your own parents stole your keys, violated your most sacred private sanctuary, and used your clean name to hide $1 million of illegal federal bribe money, would you have given them a chance to explain themselves? Or would you have installed a microscopic 4K camera, handed the decryption key to the FBI, and watched them get hauled out of your corporate office in handcuffs? Let me know exactly how you would handle this level of sociopathic family betrayal in the comments below. If you love this story of cold, calculating justice, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.